If you loved the classic clean look and durability of turned-edged applique and would love to achieve that look entirely by machine and with plenty of creative options, this video is for you. Hi, I'm Beth Ann, and today we'll be using one of my favorite methods for creating soft, durable, finished edge quilt blocks that hold up beautifully to everyday use and washing. And I've got plenty of tips to help you get the best results. I'll walk you through 5 different stitches you can use to secure your applique, ranging from a standard straight stitch to several fun decorative stitch options, to my favorite subtle invisible technique that gives the look of fine handwork without the strain. A heart block is a great block to focus on because it has some relatively straight edges, curved edges, an inner notch, and a point. So you'll be able to use what you learn on this block in lots of different shapes in the future. For reference, in case you'd like to draw your own heart shape, I'll be using a heart that is just over 5 inches across at the widest point, and just over 5 inches at the highest point at the top of the upper curves of the heart to the tip at the bottom of the heart. And please note, if you're drawing your own heart, these measurements do not need to be exact. This is just to give you a general sense of scale. Another option is to use a purchase template like this set from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. Or, if you're in my Quilting Friends membership, there's a free printable waiting for you in the membership section for the channel. It's just $3.99 a month to support the channel, and as a thank you, I share free printables and bonus resources. I'll drop a link in the description box if you're interested. When it comes to fabric choices for machine applique, I like to use fabrics that have a bit of visual texture to help camouflage the needle holes. So small prints, subtle prints, and tone-on-tone fabrics work particularly well. These are all leftovers from a previous quilt. For the blocks I'm making today, I'll need strips at least 6 inches wide and background blocks cut 8 inches square. I'll be using Pellon fusible featherweight interfacing. It's sheer enough to see through and has bumpy dots of dry adhesive on one side. Feel free to substitute another brand if you prefer. Now, if you're already comfortable with the interfacing method for turned-edged applique, feel free to skip ahead using the chapters or timestamps. I'll be sharing stitch options later that you might want to see side by side. Otherwise, let's start with the interfacing and fabric prep. A quick note here, Pellon recommends, as do I, that you pre-wash your fabric to remove any coatings that might interfere with the fusible. If you have questions about washing quilting fabric, you might find my pre-washing quilting fabric video helpful. I'll include a link in the description for that, too. I'm working on the non-adhesive side of the interfacing, so it's bumpy side down on my table. I traced 9 hearts onto a half yard of interfacing, carefully spacing each heart at least an inch apart, since these are sewing lines, not final cutting lines. Here's how the hearts look when you cut them out. I'm using the white paper just to make it easier for you to see that I've left about a ½ inch seam allowance around each heart, and that the drawing is on the smooth, non-adhesive side of the interfacing. Next, I'm using a small rotary cutter to make a slit about 1.5 to 2 inches long in the middle of the interfacing. This will allow us to turn the hearts right side out later. Now, I'm ready to cut out my first heart. My fabric is right side or pretty side up, and my interfacing is adhesive, in this case bumpy side, down, so that I can clearly see my pencil marks. I'm going to use a few pins to keep the interfacing from slipping around when I sew it. Next, a quick rough cut so I'll be able to cut out my heart more easily. And here we are, a colorful pile of hearts ready to go. Notice that it's not the end of the world if your fabric isn't always quite as wide as your interfacing, as long as there's enough fabric for a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the heart after sewing, all will be fine. For this step, I'd like to start stitching on the straight edge of the heart, not the point of the heart. Stop with your needle down in its lowest position when you get to the point or tip of the heart. Raise the presser foot, swing the fabric around, and then lower the presser foot and resume stitching right on the drawn line. If applique has ever gone sideways for you, it's likely it was on a curvy section like this, so slow down so that you feel like you can stay in control. You may need to pivot occasionally to keep the stitching line smooth. More on that shortly. Stop again with your needle down in its lowest position when you get to the inner notch. Raise the presser foot, swing the fabric around, then lower the presser foot and start stitching again. Keep on stitching. Soon you'll approach your starting point. Overlap your starting point by almost an inch. And we're doing this instead of back stitching because sometimes back stitching ends up next to your stitching line instead of right on top. And so overlapping the stitching like this will help us keep a smoother edge. Here's the area where the stitching overlaps. Next, we'll trim the fabric on each side of the point to reduce bulk. And we'll clip the fabric almost to the seam right at the inner notch. And then make additional short clips around the curved edges of the heart so that the seam allowance won't bunch up or create jagged edges when we turn our hearts right side out. An alternative to all this clipping is to cut the hearts out with pinking shears. And you don't need to go out and buy them if you don't have them, but they can be a great time saver if you already have a pair laying around. But either way, you'll still need to clip the seam allowance at the inner notch. Next up, we'll turn the heart right side out through the slit we made in the interfacing. To get the heart to look its best, we're going to take our time with the next few steps. I like to use a chopstick to help push out the point and smooth out the edges around the heart. I also like to gently coax the interfacing away from the outer edge of the heart so that a tiny bit of applique fabric shows on the back. This will help prevent bits of interfacing from peeking out around the edges of our appliqued hearts later. It's already looking smoother. Let's do a quick review of this process. I've sped the video up, but I want you to see how I've gently poked out the point and then used the chopstick to smooth out the sides of the heart, making sure there's no tiny pleats or jagged areas along the edges of the heart. Again, it's definitely worth taking your time with this step. If we go back to the instructions that came with the interfacing, we can see that it recommends a wool or steam setting and pressing for a full 10 seconds at a time. Now, I don't plan on using a damp press cloth, but it is one of the few times that I will use steam. If you're using a wool mat, make sure you've got something underneath it to protect your work surface from heat and moisture. I'm going to start by finger pressing a center crease on my 8-inch background square. And don't use your iron for this. This mark is only temporary, but it'll help us center the heart. Then I'll use my ruler to make sure I have the same amount of fabric showing below the heart as I do above the heart. In this case, it's about 1.5 inches, both below and above the heart. Per manufacturer's directions, my iron is set to the wool or steam setting, and I'm pressing for a full 10 seconds at a time. Don't rush this, and don't slide your iron around. Pick it up and move it each time. Good adhesion now will not only make the blocks a pleasure to sew without pins, but will keep the interfacing from curling or bunching up inside the blocks as the quilt is used and loved and laundered. One of the things that I love about machine applique like this is that you can choose the thread and stitch method that fits your style, your machine, and your hands. There isn't just one right answer or one right method. So, looking at these threads, I want you to remember that you don't need all of them. I just am using them today to show you how different weights and types of threads behave so that you can make your own choices. Here's what I'm using today. all-purpose 50-weight cotton thread from Orifel, slightly heavier 40-weight poly Magnifico from Superior Threads in dark and medium pinks, and then much finer 100-weight poly micro quilter, also from Superior Threads, and that's the lightest pink. If you're using comparable threads from Wonderfill, I recommend 80-weight Deco Bob as an alternative for the 100-weight micro quilter thread. I'll be using white in my bobbin with all these colors. Notice that I'm not showing any kind of clear monofilament thread. It's a great choice for machine applique, but totally optional. I typically enjoy using it, but a lot of folks find it fussy, so we're skipping it today. I want you to know that you don't have to use it if you don't want to. I strongly recommend practice stitching. Some scraps folded in half to give you a finished edge to practice on are perfect for this. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the all-purpose cotton thread and the slightly heavier and shinier polyester threads. Here's the straight stitching in progress. And notice for the final stitching, I like to start either on a straight section or on the point. And here's our finished block. Isn't it lovely? Now let's look at 3 different decorative stitches. The first was stitched with all-purpose cotton, the second 2 samples from slightly heavier and shinier decorative polyester threads. And you can mix and match threads and stitches. Here's the settings that I used on my brother's sewing machine. You can see the stitch itself, as well as the width and length that I used. Don't worry if you need to set your stitch width and length numbers differently to get the same look. Settings can vary a lot from machine to machine. And your machine may or may not have this exact stitch, so please feel free to use a different stitch entirely. And if you have an older machine that doesn't have a lot of decorative stitches, make sure to check out your stretch stitches. Sometimes there's some treasures there that also work well for applique. Here's the first decorative stitch sample in progress, and you can see that I chose to start stitching at the point. Here's the next sample stitch I used, along with the settings for my particular machine. And in progress, and again, I started at the point. And the finished block. Using a stitch that straddles the edge of the applique gives a softer, more intricate look. And here's the third decorative stitch option I'm using today, along with the settings for my particular machine. Now, with any of these stitch methods, if the fabric is starting to bunch, stop with the needle down in the fabric, raise the presser foot to release the fabric so that you can smooth it out again, pivot or turn the fabric if you need to, and lower the presser foot and resume stitching. And with any of these stitches, make sure you know how to lock the stitches at the beginning and end. Check your manual if you need to. Here we are in progress, and here's the finished block. Again, having the stitch extend into the background is a quick and wonderful embellishment technique. Finally, let's look at my favorite stitch for getting an heirloom hand-sewn look, the humble zigzag. For this stitch, I strongly recommend a blending, not contrasting thread, as I like the stitches themselves to be as invisible as possible. For that reason, I prefer the very fine threads, like 100-weight micro quilter from Superior Threads or 80-weight Deco Bob from Wonderfill. This is also a good time to use the monofilament if you're comfortable using it. Here's the settings for my particular machine. And don't worry if you need to set your stitch width and length differently to get a similar look. Remember, settings can vary a lot from machine to machine. And please ignore the strand of cat hair on my machine screen. Cat walked by. Here we are in progress. And note that even though my fabric is orange and my thread is light pink, it's barely visible since the colors are a good match in value. They're both very light. And here's the finished block. The fine thread sinks right down into the fabric and virtually disappears, giving the look of heirloom, hand-sewn applique. If you found this helpful, I'd love for you to subscribe. I share practical, encouraging quilting tutorials every week, and I'd love to have you join us. And don't forget the links in the description box. And if you have a favorite applique stitch or technique, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Happy quilting!